Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the NASPO Best Practices webinar, Effective Sourcing Methods for State Procurement. I'm Elena Moreland, NASPO Senior Project Manager, your host this afternoon. We're glad to have so many of you present for a very informative discussion on effective sourcing methods. Before we begin, let's take a few minutes to go over a few things. This webinar is being recorded. As always, we will post the recording on the NASPO website. You will be able to access this webinar recording next week, so look for it under the Best Practices section of the NASPO webinars page at naspo.org/webinars. You probably noticed that we muted everyone's phones to eliminate background noise. However, you can unmute yourselves by pressing *6 when we move into the Q&A section. Meanwhile, feel free to type your questions in the chat box as they come to you during each presentation, and I will read them during the discussion portion of the webinar. And one last reminder, NASPO members receive a certificate of participation for this webinar. Just email me at emorland@naspo.org after the webinar, and I'll be happy to send your certificate. The purpose of this Best Practices webinar is to explore a few sourcing methods used in the central procurement offices in the District of Columbia and Pennsylvania. Today, we are offering 3 examples of successful sourcing methods as presented by our panelists: reverse auctions, supplier forums, and P3s. As you all know, when used correctly, the reverse auctions can be effective tools for both public buyers and suppliers. And Pennsylvania did just that. They have used them successfully and will share that experience this afternoon. The second tool presented by our speaker from Pennsylvania is supplier forums, also known as supplier conferences, which are a great opportunity to meet with potential suppliers before an upcoming opportunity in an open and equitable manner. And last but not least, our DC speaker will discuss another sourcing method that has been around and used successfully, especially for construction projects. As you all know, this method is gaining more and more popularity in recent years for other types of procurement. And now let me introduce to you our panelists, Jenny Doherty and Todd Allen, 2 experienced professionals with both public and private sector tenure. Jenny Doherty is our first speaker. As I noted earlier, Jenny's presentation will highlight 2 procurement practices, reverse auctions and supplier forums. Jenny joined the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's Department of General Services as the Chief Procurement Officer in March 2015. She is responsible for managing several commodity teams, procuring energy, professional services, operational and facility supplies and services, transportation-related materials, equipment, and IT goods and services. She also oversees the Commonwealth's cooperative purchasing program called CoStars, as well as a strategic support team that includes training and quality assurance. Prior to joining the Commonwealth, Jenny was an independent consultant focused on conducting spend assessments and implementing strategic sourcing programs for pharmaceutical and restaurant companies. Jenny began her career in purchasing at Free Markets, now Ariba, where she worked with customers to revolutionize their purchasing practices by implementing strategic sourcing programs and online negotiation tools. Jenny is a graduate of Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Our second speaker, Todd Allen, is a contracting officer for the District of Columbia's Government Operations Division, which includes the Office of Public-Private Partnerships. Prior to entering public service, Todd served as Vice President and Senior Manager at major consulting firms such as Fleischman, Hillard, Booz Allen Hamilton, and LexisNexis. He has a Bachelor's of Science in Biology from the University of South Carolina and a Juris Doctorate from Southern Methodist University. Todd will be discussing the P3 contracting mechanism and the process followed in the district's procurement office. And now it's time for the presentation portion of our webinar. So without further delay, I'm handing it over to Jenny. Jenny, take it away.
Thank you for the nice introduction, Elena. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar. This is Jenny Doherty, as Elena said, and I'm excited to talk to you about Pennsylvania's experience doing reverse auctions and then something that we call supplier forums. So starting with auctions, reverse auctions have been around for over 20 years. The first ones were conducted in 1995 by a company called Free Markets, which, as you heard in my bio, is a company where I used to work, which was purchased by Ariba, and then Ariba was purchased by SAP. So I'm sure that most of the folks on the phone are familiar with SAP. So Pennsylvania was actually the very first state government to do an auction, and they did that in 1999 through Free Markets. However, more than 15 years went by before Pennsylvania did another auction. So we restarted them in 2015, in April of that year, about a month after I joined the Commonwealth as the CPO. So since then, we've done over 35 auctions across all types of goods, services, and IT. So sometimes I get the question from other states asking if we use a consulting firm to help us with our auction program. And I kind of jokingly respond that no, because I am the consultant that kind of implemented this, or helped to implement the program at the Commonwealth because of my background doing auctions. So our stats overall, we've done 38 auctions since April of 2015. We've trained over 140 suppliers how to participate in auctions. We've done about 220 different lots. So within each auction, we kind of organize the business into logical supply lots. So for like medical services, a lot could be, we could have a lot for doctors and a separate lot for nurses and a separate lot for kind of ancillary medical positions. Janitorial supplies, the lots could be different types of cleaning products in one lot, and then perhaps plastic bags and liners in a separate lot because the supply base is different for each of those, potentially. We've had about 7,400 bids submitted in those 38 auctions from those 142 suppliers. And of all of that activity, we've only ever had 2 lots protested. That occurred in our second auction back in 2015, and they were deemed to be clearly without merit and did not go further. So, you know, in the manufacturing world, we would kind of equate that to be less than a 1% defect rate or a protest rate in this situation. So I think overall really good stats, and no protests since that one auction in 2015. So I was asked to talk about pitfalls and keys to success, and I couldn't really come up with any pitfalls because there really aren't any pitfalls if you follow the keys to success. So those are that you have enough vendors or enough suppliers to create competition. And I often get asked, how many suppliers is that? It can be as little as 2, but the more the better. So the more suppliers you have, typically the more competition is created in the actual auction. Second key to success is to strategically lot the business in such a way that it's attractive for suppliers. And that really gets to the heart of the competition as well. So you want to kind of group things in a logical, strategic way for the suppliers to competitively kind of fight for that business. Next, you want to create a process, and this is particularly important, I think, in state government, but it's important in general. But you need to create a process for conducting auctions and then educate internal stakeholders about that process. So, you know, what are the do's and don'ts? What are the best practices? One of the kind of key success around our process is that, and this kind of jumps down to the last bullet, that we're available live for suppliers during the auctions. And we're not just available, but we know every single supplier's personal cell phone that we can reach out to them during the actual auction if we need to get a hold of them. If we see that they're not logged in and the auction's going to start in 5 minutes, we call them. We're very proactive, and they have our phone number to reach us straight into the conference room where we are during the auction. So they don't call into a help desk and have to wait or get into a queue. They call the specific phone that's in the conference room where we are sitting during that day. So that's just an example of the type of process that we created. Next is we communicate that there's a potential for an auction to the suppliers up front. So they're not alarmed, they know this is coming, and they can prepare for it. We provide personal one-on-one training for each and every supplier that participates in an auction for Pennsylvania. We choose the most appropriate auction parameters and feedback, so there's not a cookie-cutter auction format that we use for every type of auction. We sit down and strategically discuss what type of auction format is best for that particular auction. And then finally, like I already mentioned, we're available for the suppliers during the auction. So they can get a hold of us if they have a problem, if they have a question, if they lose connectivity, whatever it is that they need to call us about, they can get a hold of us. So that's it for auctions. The next best practice sourcing method that we've implemented in Pennsylvania, which from what I have heard is fairly unique, is called the Supplier Forum. So this is a very common best practice in the private sector, but is relatively innovative for public procurement. So I found when I arrived in Pennsylvania to the Commonwealth in 2015 that we had a reluctance to reach out and proactively talk to suppliers. So if we did reach out to them, and this again was very rare, we would sometimes and frequently do a request for information to try to get information from the suppliers. So what this supplier forum is, it's essentially an in-person RFI, or request for information, and it's also a networking opportunity for prime and subcontractors to network, particularly small diverse businesses, to network with potential primes on an upcoming procurement. So the forum happens at the beginning of the procurement process, well in advance of our posting a solicitation on our public site. And the purpose is to interact with the supplier community and get their feedback on best practices, pricing, timing, lotting, et cetera, to help us to create the best procurement we can possibly create. And we literally sit around a table and talk to one another. So we as the procurement folks have a list of questions that we want to talk to the suppliers about. And this is really the first part of the forum. It's spent talking to potential primes about best practices for this particular market. And we ask things like, you know, how long should this contract be? If it's something that we've done before in the past, we'll provide background information on how we've done it before. But sometimes it's a procurement that's never been done before. So like, you know, medical marijuana, didn't have a background for that, but we did a procurement over the last couple of years for that. So we have no background knowledge other than what we've researched online, what we've gleaned from other states, but we really want to get the supplier's perspective on it. So we ask a lot of questions, and we kind of furiously jot down lots of notes about what the suppliers tell us so that we can take that back and kind of look at that holistically and use that information to create our solicitation. So prior to doing the forum, we researched the market and find out who are potential suppliers in this space. This is particularly important when we haven't done the procurement before. But even if we have done the procurement before, it's important to research and find out who are all the players in the marketplace, not just ones that have responded to our procurements in the past. And then we reach out to them. We pick up the phone and we call them and we say, hey, we're working on a procurement for whatever, janitorial supplies. We found your name online. Who is the right person at your company to work with government customers? And then we invite them to the forum. We also post the forum date and time on our public website, so the whole world can see that we're having this forum. And then after we talk to the potential primes and get all this information, we have a part two, or a kind of a second half of the forum, where our Bureau of Diversity, Inclusion, and Small Business Opportunities kind of takes over and helps facilitate networking with the primes and the smalls that are in attendance. Before the forum, they actually go out and kind of recruit potential smalls as well. So they have a database of who's in their database by category. So if we're doing a forum for janitorial supplies, for example, they'll reach out and they'll also sort of brainstorm on what other markets of small and small diverse could be applicable here. You know, are there small courier services, delivery centers, marketing firms, et cetera? And they'll reach out to them and invite them to come to this forum. So we found that it has a tremendously positive impact on our small diverse business program because of this extra effort on the front end. So moving to the next slide, we found overall there are many, many benefits. One is we're getting valuable insight from the supplier community on our solicitation that we're working on. It has reduced the number of questions that come in after the solicitation is posted because we've gotten the supplier's perspective on the front end. It's a great networking opportunity for the primes and subs early enough in the process. So we were doing a bit of that before the forum, but we were wrapping that into our pre-proposal conference, which came after the solicitation was posted, and it really wasn't enough. It didn't give the suppliers enough time to form a meaningful business relationship before the proposals were due. And then finally, it helps to foster collaboration with our supplier community, something that we really weren't doing a very good job of beforehand. Something that's not on the slide that I wanted to just point out, that one of the keys to the success of this sort of brand new supplier forum process was that I got legal involved and on board with this concept at the very beginning. So our legal folks who are dedicated to procurement became a strategic ally and really true business partner throughout this whole process. And interestingly, legal does not come to the supplier forums. So we really try to promote the forum being an informal conversation and discussion around the table, and we don't need legal kind of scrutinizing everything that we say, and we don't want to inhibit suppliers speaking freely. So if you had a bunch of attorneys sitting around the table, that might kind of inhibit suppliers from wanting to share insights with you. So even though they don't come to the forums, they were a strategic ally in this whole process. And sometimes our agency customers, legal groups, question this, and they want to come to the forum, and we kind of promote why they shouldn't be there and make sure they understand, you know, what negative consequences that might happen if they are there. So anyway, that was a real huge key to success for us, is getting legal on board, because they helped then sell this concept to my internal central procurement team. So that's it for me. Moving on to Todd.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you. I was going to say just a couple of points. Great presentation, Jenny. I'm sure everyone appreciates all these best practices you shared, and thank you so much for helping us understand how you used an established sourcing method such as reverse auction and applied it in a successful way, so there are no protests and it's a win-win for both parties involved. That's really wonderful. And also thank you for sharing your experience conducting supplier forums, which are definitely on the innovative side. So thank you so much. And we're now ready for you, Todd. Please walk us through the P3s and what you guys did in the district to use this contracting mechanism. You have the floor, Todd.
Thank you, Elena. I appreciate it. First, just to give you a little background on the P3 process overall. A P3 is really a contractual agreement between the public and the private sector partners, which allows more private sector participation than traditional. The agreements usually involve a government agency contracting with a private sector company to renovate, construct, operate, maintain, and or manage the facility or system. While the public sector usually retains ownership of the facility or system, the private party will be given additional decision rights in determining, how the project or the task will be completed, of course, based on specific specifications and a statement of work. Some key components of a P3, it's a contractual agreement, between the public and the private sector, where there's a partnership. These agreements tend to go for very long periods of time. We're talking 15, 20, 30 plus years. So it is a true partnership. There is more private sector participation, i.e. they get more input, the private sector, into the actual project delivery and the finance aspect than in traditional government contracts. And the public sector usually retains ownership of the asset. So it's not privatization in any way, shape, or form. In most cases, the private sector partner is never simply a company or an entity. These are large groups of consortiums because, again, we're talking about designing, in some instances, building, financing, operating, and maintaining. So there are several aspects. In a normal procurement, this would be several contractors and several procurement actions. The ultimate responsibility of the asset will remain with the public sector. The sharing of allocation of risk is mutually agreed upon, and this is key. There will be, throughout the process, multiple discussions about risk allocations, and there will be a comparison of risk allocation between the traditional procurement method and a P3. There will be resource contributed by both parties. Again, it's a partnership. So this is a long-term relationship. We are not, again, it's not privatization, so there are some expectations of the private side and of the public entity in making sure these projects go well. It's a contractual agreement, and there is a transfer of some public responsibility to the private sector. Again, the main reason for some of these are the cost and infrastructure costs in getting these projects completed. So, we're transferring design, build, construct, operate, maintain of the asset to the private partner for a positive end result. Some examples of P3s. Again, they usually involve some element of design build or design finance with ongoing operations and or maintenance services for some fixed period of time. When the asset is complete per the terms of the agreement, the public sector will begin making predetermined availability payments to the private partner based on standards and criteria laid and spelled out in the contract. So again, think of it as, the private partner is upfront financing, designing and building this facility for you. Upon completion and upon occupancy or of the public sector, the public sector will begin making availability payments to the private partner to repay. So you can look at it also as, if you have a facility that takes $30 million to maintain, ultimately you want an availability payment that's more fiscally responsible than the $30 million you have to pay annually to maintain that structure, and factoring in the enhancements to make it a better facility for the public use. There are different types of design builds, which is just designing a building, in these aspects, it saves time. Design and constructions are consolidated and overlapped in most instances. There are cost savings due to partnerships. There's a single point of responsibility. There's a reduced conflict between designers and builders since they're on the same team and teammates. So there's more cohesiveness in actually project fruition in these projects in some instances, because again, it's one point of contact with the consortium. They're controlling all aspects of the project from beginning to end, so it's not multiple contracts with multiple points of contact, and if it goes well, it's seamless. There are DBFs, there's design build finance, same as a DB, but again, in those instances, the private partner is also financing the project as well. There's the transfer of financial risk to the designer and the builder during the contract period of construction that can be repaid during the operations, either via availability payments, or it can be, in some instances, there are toll roads that pay for it and things like that. So these can pay these fees and availability payments, or how the private sector profits, because again, they're trying to make money overall at the end of the project or during performance of this project. So again, this slide just shows there are several examples, and there's a plethora of examples. It's DBFOM, that's almost everything: design, building, finance, operating it, maintaining for the life of the assets. And of course, after certain terms and periods, we return, the asset is returned to the public sector, and of course there are strict rules, and in your scopes and in the project agreements, there'll be parameters for the return. Let's talk about the district and our process. The statute is new. We got to conduct these types of procurements. But as best practices, let's talk about first things first. Advisors, advisors, advisors. The first thing we did in the district was we put out a full and open competition for financial, legal, and business advisors to advise. Again, this is a new field in the U.S., and so all of the expertise levels across a myriad of specialities in legal, finance, and business consulting was necessary. So we put out an IDIQ, put out an RFP for an IDIQ, and let me just tell you, the interest is out there. We received 96 responses, so I had to read 96 proposals, and we ended up awarding 29 IDIQ contracts for a pool, a very robust pool of well-qualified financial, legal, and business advisors to advise throughout the lives of these projects, and that's integral and it's very important as far as making sure these projects go well. Now let's talk about our process in the district. There are two processes by which we go. It's solicited and unsolicited proposals. Solicited, and I'm not going to walk you through the entire process map, but solicited proposals are requirements that are generated within the district itself. In that instance, we go through a RFI process where we get some more clarity and more information about the interest in the industry. The purposes are the typical RFI purposes with any procurement, getting information to help refine and define the actual procurement. After that, we do RFQs, but in this case, the RFQ is a request for qualifications, by which we go out to the industry and they respond to certain specs and overall requirements, and we're then qualifying based on evaluation criteria that deal with more experience and a slight technical approach, but its evaluation criteria, it somewhat resembles a two-step bidding process where you're qualifying and you're downsizing, in this case, you're shortlisting, and then after we shortlist, we will get to an RFP, and the shortlist will receive the RFP and respond to the specific requirements, which are truly fleshed out and which can be very lengthy and very broad. Now, I will not mention throughout this process in the district, there are several layers of approval. There's council approval for the requirements, there's council approval for the RFP, and there's also probably council approval for the contract and the agreement itself. In the unsolicited approach in the district, it is when the Office of P3 actually has a certain period of time where they're designated to open the floor or there's an open window for receiving unsolicited proposals by the industry for projects they think that are viable that we might be interested in with regards to our infrastructure. Well, the process at that time is, it is reviewed by the agency, it is reviewed by the stakeholders, and then if deemed approved, then there is an opportunity for the industry to actually decide to receive alternative proposals to best the unsolicited proposal. In that instance, you can see on the right, there are two options. We can go straight to request for alternative proposals, or we can go the RFQ qualifying route, which will allow, again, for us to down select from a larger pool of those who think they have a better alternative to a smaller pool. And of course, throughout that, the original unsolicited offer will also be in that pool as well and get a chance to actually update his proposal based on the refined or defined requirement. Currently, we have two projects pending right now in the district, and it just happens that it's one of each. We have the DC Smart Lighting Project, which is a solicited P3, where we in the district defined the requirement and went out and had an RFI and issued an RFQ, and we are currently in the process of evaluating to shortlist to a group in the consortiums to receive our RFP to move forward. And just yesterday, we had the preliminary kickoff for the Henry J. Daly building, which technically is our police headquarters here in D.C. and houses some other district stakeholders as well. And that will be unsolicited. The district received an unsolicited proposal, which we deemed appropriate and approvable. And we are moving forward with the unsolicited approach. In that instance, it will be the two-step process where it will be an RFQ. And then we will evaluate based on evaluation criteria, and then there will be an RFP. And that, in a nutshell, is best practices and what we've learned and what we're going through and experiencing here in the district regarding P3 projects.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Todd. Thank you for walking us through the P3 process in DC and the key components and characteristics of P3s and the types of P3 agreements they can be used for. I really appreciate you making the clarification that this is not privatization, which may be helpful for those of us who may be P3 skeptics. So thank you so much for that.
Can I add one more thing? These are not quick fixes. These processes can take some time from inception to close. And when I say some time, it could be a year or two before you actually get to, the signing of the actual contract and moving forward with the actual requirement. That's all.
Absolutely. Excellent comment, Todd. Thank you so much. I know everyone is probably anxious to move to the next section of our webinar. So we are now going to open the floor to hear from you all. Our panelists are ready to answer your questions, so you can type your questions in the chat box. We actually have a few questions already, and please feel free to chime in and ask your questions verbally. If you have used any of these methods discussed today, or if you have a few words of wisdom to share with your peers. So given the large number of attendees we have present today, just be sure to mute your phone after you've asked your questions to eliminate background noise. So whichever you prefer, ask your question verbally or type your question in the chat box. We are happy to take your questions. And I will start with the first question that we got from Richard Pennington. It's about reverse auctions. The question is, have you tried aggregating requirements and conducting a reverse auction as a competitive procurement with another public entity?
Yep, that's a great question, and the answer is yes, we have. So when Elena read my bio to the group, she mentioned that I also oversee our statewide cooperative purchasing program, which essentially helps our local governments and nonprofits in Pennsylvania with procurement. And so when we go to market each year for road salt, and we buy an average of $100 million a year, we actually do that procurement and auction collectively with our CoStars program. So we reach out to, there's over 8,000 members, and this is optional for them, but we ask them if they want to participate, and if they do, they give us their requirements and their quantities, and then we include that with our Pennsylvania Department of Transportation spend to really go to market with a really large quantity. So it's about 50-50 too. So about half of the spend is CoStar's members spend, and half is our Department of Transportation. So they get to take advantage of our running the procurement for them and the pricing we get in the reverse auction. So we've done that two separate years in a row, and we're looking at doing more of that for other categories as well.
Hey, Elena, can I just do a follow-up real quick on that?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, did you have to guarantee a minimum or commit to satisfy requirements through that, or do they just bid based on the expectation of the volume that you publish?
So we do give a min and max, and that's kind of irregardless of whether we do an auction. And they have different mins and maxes. So the Department of Transportation min max is a little bit closer than the local governments and municipalities, so they have a wider range.
Thanks.
I think we guarantee a minimum of 65% for them, and up to like 120% of the volume. And then we've actually helped to negotiate away storage fees when they didn't hit those minimums after the fact, but they get to kind of take advantage of our procuring on their behalf and getting lumped in with our Department of Transportation spend.
Thank you, Jenny and Richard. So the next question I see is also about, no, actually it's not about reverse auctions. It's for Jenny on supplier forums. So the question is, are you able to share the list of the usual questions you have utilized at the supplier forum meetings? I realize it can be customized for each solicitation, but I thought you might have typical questions addressed regularly.
So yeah, I can kind of just rattle off some of the questions that I've typically given to the team to ask, but it really depends on the solicitation and what you need to know. But generally speaking, we ask them, you know, what's the best length of contract to allow you to be as competitive as you can? Is it 1 year, 2 years, 5 years? Are there renewal options? And we get their feedback on that. We ask them about service level agreements. You know, what are best practices around that? What are best practices in general? What are the latest and greatest trends and innovations that are happening in this market? if there's a kind of a commodity or material component to the procurement, is there a CPI or PPI that's most appropriate? Do we even need to look at that? And if so, when do we look at adjusting pricing? Is it monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, annually? Do we have kind of a range in there that we don't deal with it if it goes up or down 2% or something like that? How do you deal with technology upgrades that may occur during the course of the contract? What are lessons learned that you have garnered from working with other state governments or the federal government? So those are the types of questions that we ask a lot. And then really there's nothing off the table. I mean, if there's really specific things that you need to understand for an IT procurement, we ask them. So because this happens before we post the solicitation, we can talk about anything.
Excellent.
And there was a lot of change management involved with that philosophy. And again, that's why getting our legal folks on board at the very beginning, before I even tried to roll this out to my team, much less the agencies then after that, was really, really critical. Because then the lawyers would stand together with me and say, yes, you can ask this. Yes, you can do this. You're not going to get in trouble for doing this.
Great. Thank you, Jenny. So this is a good segue into some feedback we got from the audience. So I'll just read what we received from Stephen. Stephen says, as it relates to the second and third order effects, the reverse auction that Jenny is discussing for rock salt in Pennsylvania actually helped us here in Delaware to negotiate lower prices for our rock salt extension last year. The reverse auction actually drove the market down along with a couple of mild winters. So how about that? Thank you, Stephen. Excellent comment. And Bruce Krug says, just an FYI, Delaware is also holding pre-solicitation meetings for contracts coming up for bid to facilitate open and casual discussion and learn about the market space. It has been very well received. So that's what we had. We had a lot of questions for you, Jenny. Thank you so much for answering those. Just very quickly, I saw a question about P3s. If I can find it, it's right here. So it came from Richard. If I understand it, your P3 legislation lets you down select at the RFQ stage, and the remainder looks a lot like a competitive sealed proposal, RFP. At what time and how is cost price factored in? Todd, can you take that question?
Surely. At the RFQ stage, with the help of our financial advisors, we're evaluating financial viability. Again, the requirement is not completely fleshed out, so cost is really not a determining factor for evaluation at that time. But whether you have experience, have the equity, have the financial capes and the stuff to actually carry this project forth and maintain it, again, for the long period of performance we're looking at, which can sometimes be 30 years, to design, build, operate and maintain it, and then deal with the availability payments. When it gets down to the shortlisting, at that time, the requirement is fully fleshed out. And again, they're asked to validate and revalidate their financial capes. And they are presenting a price, of course, based on certain factors that are set so we can evaluate apples to apples. Interest rates, of course, which fluctuate. But at the time of proposal, certain variables are set in place or assumptions are made so that we can make sure that everything's viable. At that time, it's the traditional cost evaluation. With price points associated as an RFP evaluation criteria.
Excellent. Thank you, Todd. And I see, Jenny, you're already taking that question from Michael. just for everyone's benefit, the question was, do you complete an RFQ or something along those lines to create an approved list of bidders? And Jenny responded, auctions can last from 15 minutes to several hours, depending on the number of lots and number of bids submitted by suppliers. I think you took a previous question about the length of the auctions. That question was from Andra, I believe.
Yeah, and then regarding sort of the pre-qualification, when we do auctions as part of an RFP process, and sorry, I see I had a typo in my response, we only allow the companies that have been evaluated by the RFP committee to be technically viable to participate in the auctions as part of the BAFO, or Best and Final Offer step. When we do IFBs, which is the format, like basically the low bidder wins, which we'll use sometimes for like commodities or materials, we spell out that we're going to do an auction as part of the solicitation package information, and we do kind of a first round outside of the auction where we then kind of test for responsiveness and responsibility, and then we have the second round of bidding is conducted through a reverse auction. So in between the first and the second step is when we do the training.
Thank you, Jenny, for that. I think there was another question, a lot of questions coming in about reverse auctions. So there's definitely an interesting method to use. There's interest in that, in using that among the states, and I know the majority of states have used these. According to the Survey of State Procurement Practices. And I'll just read another question that came from Walt a little bit earlier. Since the reason for conducting reverse auctions is to increase competition and thereby reduce costs, what kind of advantage has your agency derived from it? For instance, more diversity supplier or a wider range of general supplier participation, more cost reduction, other, is the upfront effort and preparation, one-on-one training of participants pay for itself in cost savings? What kind of record keeping challenges do you have and how have you addressed them? A lot of questions, so yeah. Maybe you can help with that, Jenny.
So I was just looking at, I was putting together our auction savings results as we prepare for our budget hearings in Pennsylvania. And just for fiscal year 2016, which started in July of 2016 through today, auctions, we've saved over $40 million with auctions. So this cost savings is really the key driver for doing auctions. Not so much getting the small diverse business participation. So that really comes, that benefit is through the forums. So we definitely see a lot of value to the auctions. It's, you know, the cost of our folks to do the training, we're sunk cost. So we do it ourselves, so there's no extra cost. One of the questions was, what auction tools do we use? We have SAP in Pennsylvania. We use SRM, and there is an auction module included in there. We never used it. We had SAP for 10 years and never did a single auction until 2015. So that's what we use most of the time. We have also used Ariba for auctions when we needed some additional functionality that we didn't have in SRM. And we've recently implemented a couple sourcing modules in Jagger, including the one that has auctions. We have not done any auctions in Jagger yet, but I'm sure that we will once we kind of figure out how to do it and and are able to roll it out to our agencies. Did I cover all the kind of mini questions under that main question?
I think so, yeah. I'm trying to make sure we're not missing on any good questions from the audience. I see a good question from Richard here. What wouldn't be an appropriate service or supply requirement to satisfy using a reverse auction?
I would say anything where you have a single source of supply, where there's only one supplier in the market that can do something. You can't really, you're not going to have much competition there. But otherwise, I mean, I really haven't found something that doesn't apply in 20 years of doing auctions. So we've done them for very complex services like healthcare and training, to very simple things like janitorial supplies, road salt, IT hardware. So someone just asked about how we calculate savings, and we're very conservative in how we calculate savings in an auction. So we start with when the auction's over and we have an awarded supplier, we look at their pricing before the auction in the first round of pricing compared to their final auction pricing. So in many cases, that price is significantly lower than what we paid last year, but we don't count that. We just count sort of the pre-auction pricing for the awarded low bidder and the final pricing from the awarded low bidder. So in many cases, in one auction, we'll see a supplier lower their price by tens of millions of dollars, but the awarded supplier only lowered their price by maybe a couple $100,000 because they were the low one to start before the auction even started, and they drove down those higher bidders to in the neighborhood of where they were, but we only count the savings for the awarded supplier. So we take a very conservative approach with our auction savings.
Perfect. Thank you so much for taking Sandra's question, Jenny. And I believe Todd is typing in his answered Dawn's question about P3 and RIS. So I hope everyone can see Todd's answer. Let's see if we have any new questions. There's a question from Richard to Todd. Do you think you could do P3 using reverse auctions? Why or why not? Good question.
Because, in a nutshell, the rules govern the process by which P3s are carried forth, and reverse auctions I don't think would fit neatly into that process.
Thank you, Todd.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Richard, can I just follow up on that? I knew that on the compliance requirements statutorily, but one of the things in best value is you often put out a statement of objectives and try to come up with alternative approaches that aren't necessarily going to be apples-to-apples comparisons, and they're priced that way. So maybe for both of you. So how does a P3 let that happen if you're trying to invite alternative, innovative approaches and not, settle on just one? Mm-hmm. You can define. How do you do that in an auction when you're looking for a best value award?
I'll let Jenny go first since she answers both the questions.
So, I mean, we look at best value approaches in many of our RFPs, where it's not essentially apples to apples because you have different proposals, slightly different responses. You've sort of dictate what it is that you could dictate, but then you also ask them to propose and describe certain things. So that's the kind of technical piece that is evaluated and scored on its own, outside of cost. And then you have the cost for that program. So we do reverse auctions in that best and final offer step, and we say up front, we say it again during training, that you don't have to be the lowest cost in the auction, because there's technical points, there's cost points, and there's small diverse business points as well. If you want to get the maximum number of cost points, those go to the low bidder. But if you're confident that your technical is significantly better than your competitors, you don't necessarily have to be the low-cost provider. So, you know, I don't necessarily think the answer to that P3 auction question is no. I think it would depend on the situation. I really haven't run into something where a reverse auction hasn't applied. The hard part is figuring out how it applies and customize it to the specific situation.
And Richard, to answer your question on our end, when we talk about the RFP process, there are several. It's not just them responding to an RFP. We issue the requirement to the shortlist, and there are several one-on-one meetings during this process before they submit their final response that talks about, you know, where they are, where they ask questions about the agreement. Again, this is a partnership, so there must be a meeting of the minds and allocation of risks is discussed. So the requirements are defined and discussed as we move forward and may be refined as we move forward. Also, there are provisions for alternative technical concepts, and, you know, and in some cases there could be interim submissions to make sure we're all on the same page as far as where the offer is coming from and his response at that point in time. So by the time we actually get to the final submission, they've all, the requirement has been consolidated. Everyone's concerns in the smaller pool has been addressed in the final RFP. So that should deal with your question about, you know, refining the requirement, making sure we're getting the best value and the best overall deliverable based on the need of the public sector. And so at that time, after those one-on-ones, after maybe the interim submissions, after a determination about alternative technical concepts, then they respond. And by that point, we've met several times, there are several layers of discussions, and we should all be on the same page as far as the final submission.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Good questions from you all, and great answers from our speakers. It's good networking taking place right now. Lisa, I hope you saw the information from Janet. She's willing to share information for their road salt reverse auction. And Lisa had the same question about the contract in Pennsylvania, Jenny. So feel free to reach out to Jenny and Janet, Lisa, to get your questions answered. Any other questions from the audience? Well, looks like we had a lot, and thank you all for your patience answering all these great questions. And it looks like there are no other questions from the audience. So this concludes our webinar. We really appreciate everyone's participation. And many thanks to our speakers, Jenny and Todd, for a very, very informative session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.